In it here now, what are you gonna do now? I'm gonna been on here now, who bid $500,000 bid.
Welcome to the Legacy of Agriculture. This program will explore the past, present, and future of agriculture. We'll look at the people, products, and events that have formed its history. And now, with today's guest, your host, Chris Bair.
Good morning, everybody. This is Chris Bair, your host of the Legacy of Agriculture. We'd like to welcome you to our show this Saturday morning. It's a beautiful day in South Dakota, and we're excited to be here. Today, my guest is a fellow Pfeiffer's team member, Josh Erickson, is going to be joining us, and we're going to be talking about the economy clear back into the 1980s. And I'm going to introduce Josh here in just a few minutes. But first of all, before we get into the show, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Pfeiffer Auction and Realty. Pfeiffer's based out of Sioux Falls, South Dakota. The good people at Pfeiffer's have a beautiful line of machinery that they're going to be selling. And also land auctions. Lots of land auctions coming in the spring of 2024 all over the upper Midwest. And the good people at Pfeiffer's, if you're thinking about selling land or equipment, you'll want to get a hold of the good people at Pfeiffer's. And that's just as simple, Josh, as calling 605-836-2277. Or you can go to our website at pfeifers.com and go to the contact tab and call anybody that's listed right there on the contacts page. Again, a beautiful line of machinery. Josh, I want to introduce you again. You've actually been on a couple of shows with us. I appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule. You've moved down to Kansas City and now in the recording business, and we appreciate you coming up and spending time. I've wanted to do this show for a while, but I wanted the timing to be right. And this show, we're going to be talking about the agricultural crunch in the 1980s. And what happened in the 1970s and a lot of the history about it. Now, we can call Josh an expert because you have graduated with a bachelor's degree of history from Black Hills State University here a few years back, and you are continuously studying history.
Well, expert's a scary word, that's for sure. But I
definitely should we pick a different word than expert?
How about amateur historian? I like that better.
Amateur historian that's working on his expertise level?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Does that sound official?
Oh, well, maybe a little less official, but I like it better. So, yeah, I absolutely love history. I love studying it. And growing up in this part of the world, the agriculture crisis was a very big shaper of my personal family. As well as a lot of the folks who grew up through it and who live around here and who are currently the big operators of this section. So I think at the risk of sounding cliche, which you'll hear every historian talk like this, if you want to understand the present, you have to understand the past. And a big part of understanding the present in this part of the world, in the Midwest, is understanding everything that happened in the 1980s. So this is very near and dear to my heart.
So to kind of set the table for this show is in the 1970s, and that was just, I mean, I was little at that time, but in the 1970s was some of the best agricultural farming years that in the history of the United States. Machinery was short, commodities were high, farmers were able to use the limited amount of technology that they had. But the mechanized world had advanced planters and combines and both the producer's ability to plant fairly efficiently and harvest fairly efficiently. I mean, we talked about clear back last fall. We talked about the advancement in the combines and how the combines were becoming quite advanced with producers or machinery. Builders that were building rotary combines and making great advances in the traditional combines, and so the producer was able to not only get a crop in the ground efficiently, but they were able to harvest. And it was a great time back in the 1970s, and there was also a machinery shortage, kind of like what we had here a couple of years ago, where you had to wait in line to get a new tractor. You couldn't just walk into your local dealer and say, hey, I want a 130 horsepower tractor, sell me one, the dealer would say, yeah, we got to hold on just a second. So tell me a little bit what was going on there, Josh, with your research.
Yeah, so one thing that I find interesting, and I believe I've said it on your show before, if not, this will be something that was told to me by a professor. History does not repeat itself, but it rhymes a lot. And I think you'll see a lot of parallels as we go through the 1970s with some of the things that happened during COVID and all that stuff. So I'm excited to talk about that later in the show. But looking just at the 1970s, we have to first understand what's going on in the agriculture industry and then situate that in America as a whole, right? So to talk about the 1970s as a farmer, life is really good. We have a lot of new technologies, like you mentioned, that are making harvests just explode, right? You're seeing productivity that we didn't think was possible. On top of that, the 1970s sees a meteoric rise in grain exports. So, what that means is that American grain, for the first time, and maybe not the first time, but for the first time at these levels, is not staying in America, but is going to do that whole feed the world thing. So,
Right.
we've been selling grain since we've been producing it in this country. But all of a sudden, the level at which we're selling grain is just qualitatively different. We're marketing all over the world.
Not only that, but Dwight Eisenhower was focused on developing um, the freeway systems here in the United States. He was focused on connecting the East Coast with the West Coast and connecting Canada with Mexico, so that we could get, part of it was just simple interstate commerce, which agriculture was greatly blessed as a result of that, because not only could we produce a commodities, but now we had the ability to transport it and get it to a coast. We could get it to the Gulf. We could get these commodities regardless of where you were in the United States by either truck or rail, pretty darn efficiently back in the 70s and early 80s.
That's correct. And one thing that's very unique about this particular crisis is that agriculture, and if you're a farmer, you already know this, is a cyclical industry. You have your good years where you're producing a lot, so you save up a little bit, a little nest egg, so that when the lean years come around, you're still able to be operating and you're not feeling it as much. What's odd about the 1970s and then the crisis of the 80s is it is not a cycle in the same way of that agricultural cycle of good years versus bad years. Instead, it behaves as an economic boom or bust cycle.
Right.
So what we see in the 70s in the ag industry is the boom. And when you get a boom, when industries are making money, everybody's very excited about that and everybody wants a piece of the pie. So we see these rise in land prices that are partially driven, not completely, but partially driven by people investing into agriculture. So you see folks who don't have anything to do with farming, all of a sudden their money isn't going into the stock market, their money is going into ag land. And that's, like I said, it's happened before, but the 1970s sees a growth in that the industry hadn't seen before. So all of a sudden, somebody in New York is investing in agriculture in South Dakota. Usually before then, a farmer in South Dakota dealt with the farm, not somebody that far away.
Yep, they were all owner operators, really. Hey Josh, we're coming down to the end of our first segment of the Legacy of Agriculture. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. For a complete listing of all of the auctions that our sponsor Pifer Auction Realty has, you'll want to go to our website at pifers.com or call us 605-836-2277. They're great people. They do a great job, and professionals in the auction industry. Nobody, absolutely nobody, does it better than Pifers.
This is Kyle, equipment sales representative with Pifer's Auction and Realty. Pifer's is proud to provide the best seller experience around. From start to finish, our trained equipment representatives will make sure the right decisions are made to get the most money from your new or used equipment. We believe that knowledge is power, and our reps provide you with the current market estimates to help better understand machinery values. If you want to sell machinery, then nobody does it better.
Good morning, everybody. This is Chris Bair, your host of the Legacy of Agriculture. My good friend, co-worker, and historian Josh Erickson is joining us today, and we're talking about farming in the 70s and the 80s and what was going on during that period of time. Josh, since I've started the Legacy of Agriculture, I've kind of become a statistics junkie. I really watch the USDA reports. I watch reports that are coming from all different bankers. I get a lot of information from various people in the industry, and there's some things that I'm pretty proud of about agriculture in the Midwest. South Dakota is number 5 in farmland, in the number of acres of farmland, with just over 42 million. Nebraska is number 4, which is our neighbor to the south. And so the top 5 states are right here locally, with the exception of Texas and Montana. Now, we claim Montana because we border them in North Dakota, but there's just the amount of farmland that is farmed in the upper Midwest it's absolutely a staggering number. So here it's exciting for us because we love agriculture. We eat, breathe, think agriculture, both on the land side and on the machinery side. And so it's fun to talk about this stuff. In our first segment, we were talking about some of the good things that were happening in the 1970s coming into the early 1980s, Josh. What did you see that changed from the 1970s into the 80s?
I want to get into that, but I do want to hammer home one other point before I do, if that's cool, and that's the idea of the boom. We still have more ingredients to add in our recipe for disaster. So we've talked about investors and we've talked about production, but one thing that we haven't talked about is land prices. And land prices in the 1970s see a massive rise. So if you, Chris Bair, are buying land in the early 70s, you can buy land and watch every year as that land grows exponentially more expensive on the market. Now, with that, we see farmers who have now readily available credit from banks that comes from the fact that they're borrowing against that increased value of land. So, as that value of land goes up, banks are willing to loan more money based off of it. And history has consistently shown us that change is the only constant. When we live in it, we think that everything is going to keep happening the same way. But looking back on it, we know that there are lean years and there are fat years,
Yes.
very much so. So as we go into that boom of the 70s in ag land, right? Something's got to give. And the thing that causes that actually has roots even further back. That's because while ag is doing very, very well in the 1970s, other industries are not. And those other industries are victims of runaway inflation. Now, that inflation has a lot of really complicated causes. It's rooted in things like an oil embargo on Iran that affects our economy. It's rooted in things like government programs such as the Great Society, the largest government spending since the New Deal, which has tremendous benefits in uplifting people, but also requires quite a bit of money, and that can lead to inflation as well. So as farmers are doing very well in the 70s, the rest of society seems to be struggling with this inflation. That needs to have the brakes put on it. So we see rising interest rates. And rising interest rates slow that rise in land prices. That's kind of the switch that flips. Your land prices that you're borrowing against, that rise in land prices starts to slow down. So you as an operator who has an increased amount of debt, more than you've ever had on an operation before, you're starting to see that money dry up. All of a sudden, credit isn't right there as soon as you walk into the bank because banks need to protect themselves, and other
Yes.
industries do too.
Well, not only do the banks protect themselves, but they're heavily regulated by the FDIC.
Exactly.
And a lot of people don't understand that, they say, well, I got in trouble. It's not my fault that I got in trouble financially. But the reality of that situation, and most people don't know and understand that when a loan goes into default, that the regulators, the FDIC and the bank regulators actually force their hand and require a bank to protect the owners of the bank, regardless of who they are, against disaster, which is if you have a loan that's defaulted, the bank actually has to be acting on that default in some way, shape, or form in order to collect that money, or to, if the loan is secured with other land or machinery, then they have to have a long conversation with that borrower to protect that bank's interest.
Exactly, exactly. And one thing, you hear the line in movies all the time, it's not personal, it's just business. It's a very real thing. I think that when you're involved in something like this, it's easy for emotions to run high. But at the end of the day, economies, especially national economies, are complex systems. So trying to personalize it can kind of, you miss the forest for the trees. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So.
That's exactly right. So what changes did you see in your research, Josh, from the 70s to the 80s? Because agriculture, we had rising inflation, as you were talking about. We were starting to see a rise in interest rates. We saw a pretty mean grain embargo, um, against another country that basically stopped the exports, basically stopped wheat from being exported in the United States, which absolutely tanked commodity prices, corn, beans, wheat. And it started to have a very, very serious snowball effect, both on the consumer side, but also on the agricultural side as well. What did you see with that?
So in the 1980s, the Soviet Union at the time, the USSR, invades Afghanistan, and Americans do not like this. Now remember, the 80s is still during the Cold War, and for younger listeners, people my age, it's a little hard to conceptualize what the Cold War was really like living in it. But at the time, every expansion of the Soviet Union is seen by Americans as a threat to American interests. So this invasion of Afghanistan is very, very concerning to people. And so America does not like it. We boycotted the Olympics in Moscow. There were American Olympians who did not get to compete in Moscow because we did not believe that that was a just war and that that was acceptable. But the grain embargo is an odd situation where what is attempted to rein in an enemy combatant backfires completely. And this is something that's been studied extensively. So we're exporting quite a bit of grain to the Soviet Union because America, again, has started exporting a lot of foods that leads to rising prices. But when we try and turn that faucet off, you have people who are expecting those rising prices to continue. All of a sudden, they've over leveraged themselves. And this is not a one or two individuals, this is a system wide thing. And so, as that faucet is turned off, what we see is that Russia, again, the Soviet Union at the time, they're just fine. They begin exporting large amounts of grain from Argentina. And so, out of this grain embargo, the Soviet Union learns that it doesn't, in fact, need grain from what we call the first world, from the Western world. It can get its grain elsewhere. And American farmers, the people who also disagree with this war, find themselves in the crossfire of that. The people who suffer most from this embargo, from this sanction, is the American farmer, not the Russian consumer, because the Russian consumer gets their grain at a cheaper price from Argentina,
From a different country.
where they don't have to pay their workers as much.
That's exactly right.
Exactly.
Cheaper grain. We're going to continue on, and the United States tries to strong arm and really does start to suffer as a result of that.
Yep.
So it's an interesting scenario and an interesting situation, because as we roll in, and there's a massive change in politics at that time with Ronald Reagan coming in. He's elected as president, and here's a movie star now that is taking the seat in the White House to be the most powerful person in the world, basically. And he's got a lot of different ideas. Hey, folks, we're coming to the end of our second segment. I appreciate my guest, Josh Erickson, a historian, for being on the show with me here this morning. I'm Chris Bair, your host of the Legacy of Agriculture. And in just a few minutes, we're going to be right back with our third segment. Hang tight.
This is Jasmine with Pfeiffer's Auction and Realty. We have a great lineup of machinery and farm sales this spring. Many of them already have listings available on our website. If you're looking to buy land or machinery, Go to www.pifers.com to see a complete catalog of our auctions. It's updated daily, so make sure to check back in with us and find the perfect lot for you. When it comes to auctions, nobody does it better.
Good morning, everybody. This is Chris Bair, your host of the Legacy of Agriculture. My good friend Josh Erickson has joined me today, recording the Legacy of Agriculture. Thank you, Josh. We're having a great conversation about the 70s and 80s. Again, the 70s were a huge boom for agriculture. We've had a change in U.S. president in 1980 with Reagan, and all of a sudden we have had prior to that a grain embargo and high inflation, and now interest rates are starting to chase the inflation, and we got some pretty serious problems. And into the 80s with this grain embargo, our commodities are simply a supply and demand. It's basic economics. If we've got too much of a commodity, if there's too much corn, the prices go down. Then as soon as the prices go down, people quit planting it because you can't make money on it. Less acres are planted, the demand goes up, prices go up, we plant more corn. It's always been that cycle in anything, whether it's a consumer product or whether it's a commodity in agriculture. So the government steps in, and we always hear that the government's here to help, right? And when the government shows up and says, we're here to help, you better have both ears listening, because it's probably not going to be good, right?
Yep.
So, but they're smart, they're brilliant people that was working for the USDA. And one of the things that happened that I remember very vividly as a young man is that the government, in order to try to settle the acreage down and try to get the supply back under control, bins are full. Bins are full of corn, they're full of wheat, they're full of beans, and so they come out with a set aside program that if you put your land aside and you don't farm that land, we're going to pay you not to farm. And as a young man in high school, I remember that very well, because I grew up on an irrigated farm, and my dad actually participated in some of his land because there was some marginal farms that we had at that time, and he wanted to do the improvements. This was a great opportunity to go out and to clean up farms and improve irrigation systems, and to clean up rocks and clean up low-lying areas and make his farm more productive. But also at that time, the government did something that I personally didn't necessarily agree with, was as they were willing to do 100% guaranteed 100% loans. So if you needed a $500,000 to farm, and your farmland appraised for 400,000, and you had $100,000 worth of machinery, they would guarantee loans at 100%. So you could go borrow that $500,000 to farm year after year. But the downside of that was as banking practices today, as well as back then, was as you had to have, if you wanted to borrow $500,000, you had to have probably pretty close to $700,000 or $800,000 worth in equity to borrow that 500,000. So there was a lot of marginal farmers that continued to farm that really shouldn't have been farming. They should have sold, retired, taken what equity they had. But into the 90s, after we kind of moved through this crisis, we had a lot of farmers out there that could not afford to update. They had no credit left, and they had to sell. And so there was quite a period of time, clear into the early 90s, that there was kind of I hate to use the word cleansing, but there was some cleansing that went on. So anyways, here we are back in the 80s, and what else was going on besides this?
So Ronald Reagan as a figure is very interesting because a large support of his farmers comes from the idea during his campaign that he is going to end the grain embargo. We are going to start selling grain to the Soviet Union. and America operates as a representative republic.
And the Cold War had ended.
So the Cold War is still going on actually during Reagan's administration. What's really interesting though is even during that, the voice of farmers is heard so much that during this turbulent time, Ronald Reagan is still willing to sell to someone who most Americans consider an enemy, right?
Right.
And that's what's really fascinating about it. And so as Ronald Reagan is promising to end that embargo that's hugely unpopular, it does help him get into the Oval Office. Um, the 80s crisis is odd. Like all of history, it's a domino effect, right? As you mentioned. And as farmers start to go under, banks hold on for quite a long period of time. We don't see a change in 1980, 81, 82, even 83 in the number of banks that are shutting their doors due to this ag crisis. So even though farmers are starting to feel that squeeze, banks seem okay for a little while until the mid 80s. And this is why the crisis seems to stretch itself out for quite a long period of time. In 1985, and I'm going to get the statistic wrong, there was something like a 50% of the bank closures during that year were all ag banks. Now, they aren't clustered together, so they're not ag banks all in Iowa or all in South Dakota.
They were very fragmented.
Yes. What that means is that those banks are most likely the ones who had over leveraged themselves into agriculture. And so today, ag banks have a tendency to diversify much more than they did during that crisis. And it's a way of building a more stable base around those banks so that they don't lead into more farm closures as they're having trouble. So that's what's really fascinating is we do learn from history, as optimistic as that sounds. We do kind of learn our lesson a little bit, and banks are shoring themselves up in a way that they weren't during this time period. Um, but the damage is done. During that crisis, as we move into the 1990s, we see some of that readily available money dry up, and as that happens, more and more of these farms are sold off. And you would actually have more experience in the 90s than I would have, because I was just being born towards the tail end of that. But the 1980s farm crisis, it has a myriad of causes. And one thing that's very interesting about history is almost everything can be changed beforehand. There's not one specific cause of the 80s farm crisis, and there's not one specific cause of the politics that follows afterwards. Instead, it's kind of a perfect storm that leads into it.
Right. Hey, folks, we're coming down to the end of our third segment. We've got a brisk conversation going on with Josh Erickson, historian, Black Hills State graduate. We appreciate Josh for joining us on the Legacy of Agriculture. We're going to be right back in just a few minutes. We're going to go to commercial break, and then we're going to be back with the Legacy of Agriculture. Give us just a few minutes, and we'll be right back.
This is Kyle, equipment sales representative with Pfeiffer's Auction and Realty. Pfeiffer's is proud to provide the best seller experience around. From start to finish, our trained equipment representatives will make sure the right decisions are made to get the most money from your new or used equipment. We believe that knowledge is power, and our reps provide you with the current market estimates to help better understand machinery values. If you want to sell machinery, then nobody does it better.
Good morning, everybody. This is Chris Bair, your host of the Legacy of Agriculture. Josh Erickson, historian, has joined me in the last and final segment of the Legacy of Agriculture. We're having another great conversation about the 70s and 80s into the early 90s. And Josh, as we're talking about what happened to agriculture in the 80s, that was 40 years ago, give or take. Okay, we're 2024 now. We're coming into the very beginning of the crop year. 1980 was 44 years ago. And I guess the $100 question is, as we know, and you've said it a couple times, and I said it, history has a tendency to repeat itself. We have come off from some of the greatest agricultural years that we have seen in forever. What's going to happen now?
So that's, if
Should we I think what we need to do is get our crystal ball out. We'll put it on the desk right here. let the fog clear out, and then the crystal ball will tell us, right?
Exactly. And that's the thing with studying history is you can never accurately point to the future, but you can get close by looking into it, right? Your goal with studying history is to try and use the knowledge you gain from the past to better understand the present and hopefully the future. And in that way, the 1980s serve as a warning against some of the things that can cause trouble because if it's happened before, it can happen again. What we're seeing for parallels between this 80s farm crisis and the markets of today. We are seeing amazing ag prices. We are seeing land that brings wonderful money, and that's great for people who are selling, right? But we're also seeing other industries throughout the United States that have suffered from inflation, and part of that is largely due to COVID. Um, so we also look into not just ag land prices, but the leveraging of debt. I'm naturally a frugal guy, so far be it from me to tell someone else how to run their business. But one thing that I've noticed is that many very successful farmers are very in tune with the amount of debt they have and whether or not that debt is necessary, right? Sometimes you simply have to borrow money. I don't have money in my back pocket for a quarter of land. That's
You're not
simply
going to go borrow $5 million tomorrow.
I would not because I know what I'm capable of paying back. And that's just it. A lot of times when people look at the future, we love to have optimism. Again, I think we're naturally optimistic people during the good times. When things are good, things are gonna be good forever. And you have to put on your pessimist glasses, right? You have to look at the future as something bad that could happen, not in a sense that you let it paralyze you, but in a sense that you leverage debt accordingly.
You have to analyze and manage your risk
Exactly.
is what you're talking about.
Very much so.
What is the risk out there with me farming or putting a crop in the ground?
Exactly. And one thing that I think that's very promising about the time period that we exist in now, the farmers of the 1980s had no experience with the global exports at that level, with the land prices at that level, anything like that. So when the 80s crisis hits, it's out of the blue. And it's devastating for that reason. People are reacting, right? Today, we see some of the signs of possible crises on the horizon. It's possible. Nothing's ever guaranteed. But, like I said before, all events in history can be avoided. Nothing's set in stone. And a lot of the owner operators that are working today are people who grew up in the farm crisis. I talked to one of Piper's customers, and he mentioned the fact that he did not like to throw out jeans because he remembers being a kid and only having the one pair of pants on the farm. So he doesn't like to throw out his church jeans, his holy jeans, right?
And then what happens is they don't throw the clothing away. It gets cut up and into rags, and it goes in the rag barrel out in the shop to clean up oil off the floor.
Exactly.
I mean,
Exactly.
it gets used to the very end. One of the things that, and I want to make sure that on this show that we're not forecasting any doom or gloom. That's not our purpose, and that's not what our goal. We're not economists by any means. I'm just a farm boy, right? Is as I sit back and I think about agriculture, what agriculture was in the 80s and the 90s and what agriculture is today. Agriculture has changed in the fact that you could take the same section of ground, half section or quarter, and you're producing double the crops. And what has changed that? One thing that has changed from the 70s and 80s is the ability to produce so much more on the same acre. And what's driven that is a number of things. One is technology, the advancement of the technology of the planter. What these planters will do now versus what they did in 1980, it's incredible what technology has done in seed placement, in managing that seed once that seed gets in the ground. The rows are straighter. You're not overlapping any seed that's being planted, but also genetics have changed substantially. Um, when you plant a seed in the ground now, 90-day corn has completely changed the face of the amount of corn acres that are planted. For example, our good friends up in North Dakota, a 90-day corn versus 120-day corn gives our friends to the north the ability to plant corn acres and grow a good crop in a shorter amount of time. So there's lots of things that are going on with technology and with genetics, and that's come with education. Our producer is much more educated now than they were back in the 60s and the 70s. Not to knock on our producers back then, but that's just the facts.
And knowledge is power. The fact that we have that education and that experience of that time period means that as different challenges arise, people are more capable of dealing with them. And I find that to be very much so a blessing during these times, is that the folks who grew up during that, they're able to handle those things. They're able to handle themselves. Your show's titled The Legacy of Agriculture. Part of that legacy is learning from past mistakes. And that's one thing that I think American farmers have proven time and again they seem capable of doing. So I may sound or come across as doom and gloom, but I really am an optimist about the future. I really do think that our producers today have the necessary experience and knowledge to handle what the world is throwing at them. And I think that our companies are reacting to that as well. I've worked with Pifers for quite a while. They're kind enough to sponsor this show. One thing that I find very wonderful that they do is they have online auctions where they provide internet bidding, but they provide all their internet customers with pictures and information on their items as well. Something as simple as knowing what a piece of machinery is affects what you're bidding on it, and that's very true.
And getting that information out there. If you want to go down the auction road, it used to be 20 years ago that the only information that we could get to a potential buyer was in the form of a flyer or a brochure. Some people would call them brochures, or in newspaper print advertising, where today we drive people to the website to say, for the most current up-to-date information, go to our website. And I've said that a million times over, is you don't necessarily need to pick up the newspaper. Just go to the website, because what we printed yesterday is out of date. It's completely gone. Josh, unfortunately, we're out of time. We just got a few seconds left on the legacy of agriculture. This has been a great conversation, and it's always a treat to have you. We appreciate you coming up from Kansas City and spending some time with us. You come from a great family, and we greatly appreciate it. Folks, to shout out to our sponsor at Pifer Auction Realty, we've got a great line of machinery that we're going to be selling in about 10 days. Go to our website at pifers.com, that's PIFERS.com, or call us 605-836-2277. Nobody does it better.
Been on here now, who bid $500,000 bid.
We hope you've enjoyed today's edition of The Legacy of Agriculture with Chris Bair, sponsored by Pifers Auction, Realty, and Land Management. Call Pifers at 605-836-2277.